When Percy Jackson gets through the Sea of Monsters and finally makes it to the island of Polyphemus, he meets the Cyclops and finds out that he's nearly blind. This is how Grover managed to survive for as long as he did, since the Cyclops couldn't tell he was a satyr. And even though Annabeth hinted at the story, we wanted to take a full video and break it all down. When Percy and Annabeth are trying to evade Polyphemus, Percy calls himself Nobody and sends Polyphemus into a rage as he remembers how he was blinded. Not by Nobody, but by Odysseus, who called himself Nobody. The Sea of Monsters draws a lot on different myths, but it's mostly a hybrid of the Odyssey and Jason's quest for the Golden Fleece. And in the Odyssey, Odysseus and his crew were shipwrecked on the island as they returned home from the Trojan War. Initially, the Cyclops offer them refuge, giving them food and a place to rest, and they eventually make their way to the cave of Polyphemus, where many of them fall asleep. It's important to remember that Polyphemus wasn't necessarily a soldier or savage. He's just a shepherd who was out with his sheep when they made themselves at home in his cave. When he returns, he's enraged to find a crowd of guests who had invaded his home and helped themselves to his food and supplies. He sealed the door with the same giant boulder that we see in the Sea of Monsters book, and Odysseus and his remaining men had to figure out how to survive the night with the Cyclops. Polyphemus ate 2 of them and then turned in for the night, knowing that his food was captive and that humans weren't capable of doing any lasting damage to a Cyclops, especially one of Polyphemus' size and stature. The next morning, he ate 2 more of Odysseus' men and then took his flock to graze once again, so he opened the door, let the flock out, and shut them inside. Odysseus, much like Percy and Annabeth, didn't have any luck moving the boulder out of the way, so they had to come up with a plan to get away. But they needed 2 things to go perfectly. Number 1, they needed the boulder to be moved out of the way, and only Polyphemus was capable of doing that. Secondly, they needed a way to funnel all of the survivors out, but the opening was still narrow enough that they would have created a bottleneck if they'd all tried to rush out at once. A few of them could have very well made it to safety by running as soon as the door was opened, but the rest of them would have been caught and eaten shortly thereafter. So what the team needed to do was to come up with a plan to subdue Polyphemus while also making sure that he didn't block the doorway. If they killed him while he was coming in, then his dead body might block the doorway and leave them stuck inside again. But Odysseus was a notoriously crafty demigod. There is a slight disparity between the Sea of Monsters novel and the original Odyssey. That happens a lot with different myths, which is why we like to specifically focus on the canonical events of the Percy Jackson series. The events of the series aren't always completely in line with the original myths, but it helps us keep a consistent basis. In the Sea of Monsters, Annabeth states that Odysseus used a hot iron rod to blind Polyphemus, while in the Odyssey, it was a large log that had been sharpened into a spear. This is most likely actually a hybrid, because in the original Odyssey, Odysseus sharpens the wooden spear and then hardens it in a fire, which is probably what Annabeth is referring to. When the Cyclops got back, Odysseus offered him wine until the Cyclops became much more open about himself. He asked Odysseus his name, to which Odysseus replied, "Nobody." And this is where Percy and Annabeth get their idea. This particular interaction is what much of chapters 14 and 15 are based on, because only when Polyphemus passed out did Odysseus and his crew make their grand escape. His plan had 2 parts. Number 1 was to blind Polyphemus, and when they stabbed him in the eye, he screamed out to the surrounding island that nobody was killing him. When the rest of the Cyclops came barging into the cave, Odysseus and his men hid so that everyone else simply thought Polyphemus had lost it. He was in pain, yelling that nobody had blinded him, and they wrote him off. But the escape didn't happen until the next morning. This is why hearing that nobody had returned sent Polyphemus into such a blind rage, because he'd been regarded as crazy for centuries ever since the original Nobody blinded him and made the rest of his colony think he was delirious. When a now blinded Polyphemus took his sheep out to graze the next morning, Odysseus and his men clung to the undersides of the sheep, which Percy himself does in the book. In the Sea of Monsters, he actually does this to get into the cave in order to locate Grover, but the same basic premise is how Odysseus got himself and his crew out. Polyphemus moved the boulder and couldn't see the crew, so when they made it out to the field, they were able to get off the sheep and get away. Odysseus, however, could not leave well enough alone, and like most Greek heroes, had to ruin it at the last moment. He got back to his ship and prepared to launch, but he called back to the mainland to gloat one last time, this time identifying himself by his real name. In the Percy Jackson books, this part is not directly clear, but it did play a large part in the remainder of the Odyssey, and it's too large of a detail to leave out. As mentioned in the books, Cyclopes are children of Poseidon, and so when Odysseus called back to the mainland and identified himself, Polyphemus took it up with his father to make the rest of his voyage miserable. The biggest reason why we're confident that this detail is still canon in the Percy Jackson universe is because when the Birmingham leaves, they have to evade several boulders that have been thrown by Polyphemus, which is exactly how he saw Odysseus off. The entire Sea of Monsters novel is a modernization of both the Odyssey and Jason's quest for the Golden Fleece, and the stops that Percy and Annabeth make along the way directly line up with Odysseus' time sailing home from Troy, down to this moment. Because of this, it seems almost certain that Odysseus had to deal with this in the Percy Jackson universe, and therefore probably revealed his name to Polyphemus. It is important to mention, however, that he doesn't seem to remember this, which is actually addressed in the novel. He says that he remembers nobody, but Percy retorts with a remark that he's too stupid to remember anybody, much less nobody. So what probably happened is that these two identities occupy two different memories in his mind. He remembers nobody, and he may very well remember hurling boulders at Odysseus, but he might not immediately remember that they were the same person, especially after so long. When Percy and Annabeth get to the island, they already have a playbook for dealing with Polyphemus that they can use. From riding the undersides of the sheep, to calling themselves nobody, to getting Polyphemus to move the boulder in order to get Grover out. And it was all thanks to one of the most iconic heroes in all of Greece. So, that's how Polyphemus was initially blinded, and why Percy and Annabeth were able to pick up where Odysseus left off, but be sure to let us know what corners of this universe you'd like us to cover next. We love talking about this series, and we'd love to get your input, so be sure to join in on the conversation. Take care, everyone, sail safe, don't anger the gods, and we'll see you in the next one.